June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The train hissed to a stop under a moonlit sky. Steam drifted through the heat. On the platform, hundreds of small-town Americans stood quietly, farmers, shopkeepers, church ladies in summer dresses watching the impossible. Down from the Pullman cars stepped men who only months earlier had fought under the banner of the Desert Fox, veterans of Tunisia, soldiers of the Afrika Korps. But this was no forced march. No chains, no cattle cars, no dogs. Instead, cushioned seats, dining service, white tablecloths. Outside, electric lights glowed from every street corner. Neon signs buzzed over diners still open past 10. To men who'd lived under Germany's blackout laws for 3 years, it was like stepping into another world. Through the train window, Sergeant Friedrich Radke had already written it in his hidden diary. The Americans must be lying. No nation can fight a world war and live this way. Yet everything saw contradicted 3 years of propaganda. Electricity pouring endlessly. Cars lined up outside shops. Radios playing music instead of war bulletins. They had been told America was weak, decadent, chaotic, racially divided. But on this summer night in Texas, the truth burned too brightly to ignore. What none of them realized was that this moment, quiet, polite, and almost peaceful, marked the beginning of the end of Nazism itself. Because America was about to wage a psychological campaign more powerful than any bomb, a war of abundance. Within months, thousands of German prisoners of war would be scattered across the United States. They would eat better than they had in years, sleep in electrified barracks, and witness an industrial civilization operating at a scale their homeland could not even imagine. And slowly, without speeches or threats, their faith in Hitler's world would crumble. This is the story of how America broke the Nazi mind, not through interrogation, but through illumination. It began in North Africa, May 13th, 1943, Tunisia. The Afrika Korps, once Rommel's proud army of desert ghosts, finally stopped fighting. 270,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, the largest Axis capitulation since Stalingrad. For many, defeat meant only one question: where will they take us? Some feared Siberia. Others imagined British mines or French camps. No one expected America. From the shattered ports of Oran, Algiers, and Bizerte, they were marched toward the sea boots broken, faces burned by desert sun, and pride still smoldering under exhaustion. But what awaited them? There wasn't vengeance. It was organization. The Americans processed prisoners by the tens of thousands each day. Fingerprints, photographs, medical exams, inoculations, and clean uniforms. They were given soap, cigarettes, and information sheets explaining their rights under the Geneva Convention in perfect German. One captured sergeant muttered, "We've been captured by bureaucrats." Another replied, "No, by engineers." That precision alone began to shake them, because it revealed something their officers had never admitted. American efficiency didn't just exist, it surpassed theirs. Then came the food. Oberrichter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, would later write to his mother, "They fed us better in 1 day than in 6 months of Africa. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day." They believed it was psychological warfare until they realized this was simply the American standard ration. The final insult to ideology came in steel and rivets, the Liberty ships. When the Germans learned that one of their transports, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in 4 days and 15 hours, they laughed. Propaganda, they said, but it wasn't. American shipyards were launching 3 such vessels a day, each carrying supplies to Europe and returning with human cargo 30,000 prisoners a month by that summer. Each rivet, each hull plate was a quiet declaration: "You cannot outproduce us, you cannot outlast us." For the prisoners, the Atlantic crossing would not just separate continents, it would separate belief from reality. The men who boarded those ships still believed in Hitler's promises. By the time they reached Norfolk, Virginia, many would already suspect the unthinkable, that everything they'd been told about America was a lie. The voyage across the Atlantic lasted 2 weeks, calm seas, guarded skies, and an uneasy silence among 30,000 prisoners who had never imagined they'd see the New World. Their transport ships were called Liberty ships, floating proof of what American industry could do when it decided to win. Each vessel, identical to the last, had been built from 250,000 parts made in 32 states, engines from Michigan, steel from Pennsylvania, copper wiring from Illinois. To men raised on tales of Aryan superiority, the idea that a democracy could coordinate this kind of precision was incomprehensible. On deck, German soldiers leaned against railings, staring at the endless horizon, their uniforms bleached by salt and surrender. But the real shock wasn't the ocean, it was the food. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division wrote home months later, "The Americans threw away more food in a day than my company received in a week, steaks half-eaten. Loaves of bread tossed overboard, gallons of milk poured out because they'd sat too long in the sun. They weren't mocking their captives, they were simply careless with abundance." To men from a land of ration cards and empty shelves, that carelessness was terrifying. In the ship's mess hall, the guards ate beside them, not apart, not above, just together. One sailor asked a prisoner if German submarines were really as good as people said. Another joked about baseball. No propaganda, no hatred. Just small talk, and that, somehow, was more disarming than any interrogation. But the most devastating lesson came from the machines themselves. Radar, a word whispered like magic in German laboratories, spun silently above the ship's bridge. To see such technology, not on a secret base or a battleship, but on a cargo freighter, it shattered illusion. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stuber, whose family had served Prussia for generations, later confessed in his memoirs, "As the antenna turned, I understood for the first time that we had already lost the war. The Liberty ships were floating classrooms in defeat. Every engine hum, every flicker of radar, every plate of wasted food taught the same lesson. America wasn't a country, it was a factory. And the factory never slept." When those ships neared the Virginia coast in August 1943, the prisoners gathered on deck. They expected ruins, depression, chaos, maybe a hungry people forced into war. What they saw instead was power. Cranes, docks, and miles of coastline shimmering with movement and light. One guard shouted above the wind, "Welcome to America, boys." They didn't know it yet, but they were about to enter a nation that would redefine everything they believed about war, wealth, and human worth. August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. As the Liberty ships slid into harbor, the prisoners crowded the rails, squinting through the morning haze, and froze. Before them stretched 4,000 acres of docks, cranes, and warehouses, each alive with motion. Dozens of ships loading and unloading simultaneously, an industrial ballet so vast it looked choreographed. Crane arms swung like steel limbs over the water, lifting entire tanks, jeeps, and crates in seconds. Conveyor belts moved endlessly. Forklifts buzzed. Steam hissed from pipes feeding unseen engines. For soldiers raised in Germany's grey austerity, it was like watching a civilization from another planet. Sergeant Georg Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before the war, secretly counted 47 cargo ships at various stages of loading, each one bigger than anything he had ever seen. He wrote later in his diary, "One port in Virginia handles more in a day than Hamburg does in a week." The prisoners were lined up for their next journey inland. But even as they formed ranks, they couldn't help staring at what surrounded them. Parking lots filled with civilian cars, hundreds of them owned by dock workers, not officers. In Germany, a car was a symbol of privilege. Here, it was a tool, common, ordinary. They had been promised Volkswagens, the people's car. Only 1,000 had ever been built. And yet here, the people already had cars, not promises. When the whistle blew, the guards began guiding them toward the trains. Again, they braced for humiliation: boxcars, wooden benches, chains on the doors. Instead, they stepped into something else entirely: Pullman passenger coaches, padded seats that folded into beds, dining cars with white linen and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners," wrote one corporal. The guards even apologized when the air conditioning malfunctioned. Air conditioning, a luxury they believed existed only on Hitler's personal train. As the train pulled away, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass. They expected fields and poverty. What they saw were highways lined with cars, streetlights glowing, factories running through the night. Each mile deeper into America tore another page from the Nazi handbook of lies. By midnight, the train rolled through Virginia towns alive with light: Danville, Martinsville, Greensboro. Every storefront illuminated, every home lit from within. In Germany, light was rationed, restricted. Here, it flowed like oxygen. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, scribbled into his notebook: "They leave lights burning in empty buildings. Fans spin in vacant rooms. They waste power as if the supply were infinite." And that was the revelation. For men raised in scarcity, American waste was indistinguishable from wealth. Every glowing bulb, every humming motor, every careless abundance whispered the same truth: the Reich had built a myth. America had built a civilization. The prisoners sat silently as the train clattered westward, their reflections flickering in the window glass. Outside, 1,000 small towns glowed under a web of electric light. Inside, an empire of lies began to die. Through the windows, the German prisoners watched factories glowing against the dark, their chimneys spilling not smoke, but light. Sparks flickered from foundries still running past midnight. Parking lots overflowed with cars. Rail yards stretched for miles. Every small town they passed was brighter than Berlin had been in peacetime. In Germany, war meant darkness, blackout curtains, candles, whispers. But here, at 2 in the morning, America blazed like daylight. Obergefreiter Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, later wrote, "The waste was magnificent. They left lights burning in empty halls. Electric fans spun in deserted offices. We were witnessing the carelessness of infinite resource." That line spread among the prisoners like gospel, because for the first time they understood that the war had never been a fair contest. One nation was running on adrenaline and ideology, the other on electricity. At a rail stop in Roanoke, Virginia, they watched workers refuel and service the locomotives. No shouting, no chaos, no delays. Automated coal loaders poured fuel. Water pumps hissed. Lubrication systems whirred quietly. 30 minutes later, the train moved on. In Germany, the same process would have taken 2 hours with 10 times the manpower. And then came something even harder to comprehend: the workers themselves. The Americans they saw were ordinary, not officers, not party members. Yet every man wore leather boots, smoked cigarettes without ration cards, and drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles. They laughed, they joked, they worked like men who feared nothing. One prisoner whispered, "These are not masters, but they live like kings." As dawn approached, the train crossed the Tennessee River. On the horizon, factories stretched like cities. The Alcoa aluminium plant burned bright, a mile of furnaces, devouring more electricity than all of Munich combined. Overlearning Erich Hoffmann, A chemist from IG Farben could identify every piece of equipment from afar: distillation towers, catalytic crackers, refineries. He realized in silence what others would only suspect later. America's industrial scale was not exaggerated, it was beyond imagination. Even as the train slowed near Louisville, another revelation rolled into view: the Rubbertown complex. 4 synthetic rubber plants had been built in just 18 months, producing 6 times what Germany managed in its best year. One German whispered, "They built entire industries while we built statues." And then came Detroit. The prisoners couldn't see all of it, but they felt it, the heartbeat of an empire of machines. Ford's Willow Run plant, stretching for almost 2 miles, was visible from the rails. Inside that factory, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The guards said it casually, as if it were nothing. But to the Germans, it was everything. Their factories could barely replace what the Allies destroyed. America was producing an air force every week. Oberfeldwebel Hartmann, a Luftwaffe pilot, pressed his face to the window as they passed. He saw half-built bombers, cranes lifting fuselages, and floodlights so bright they hurt his eyes. He muttered, "We were told their planes were inferior. I can see the precision from here." In that moment, the myth of German superiority died quietly inside the rumble of a passing train. They had believed their nation was destined to rule the world. Now they realized someone else already had the tools to build it. As night gave way to morning, the train thundered westward toward Texas. The land seemed endless. So did the factories, the farms, and the light. Every mile deeper into America buried another illusion. And by the time the first cactus appeared beyond the window, they were no longer wondering how Germany would win. They were wondering how it had dared to begin. By autumn 1943, the war for the German mind had moved from factory floors to dinner tables. Inside the fences of Camp Hearn, Texas, the air smelled of pine and coffee. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, each wired for electricity, each with flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. To men who had spent years in sand and dust, this wasn't imprisonment, it was civilization. But the real shock wasn't comfort, it was compassion. That December, America prepared for Christmas. And in small towns across the South, people remembered the strangers behind the barbed wire. Church choirs learned carols in German. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards. Women baked cakes and cookies for men who months earlier had aimed rifles at their sons. At Camp Hearn, the Methodist choir stood outside the fence and sang Stille Nacht. Prisoners gathered in silence, some smiling, some crying. When the guards handed out packages, cigarettes, candy, razors, games, it wasn't propaganda. It was mercy. Overlearning Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the Hamburg bombing, wrote later, "They know we are their enemies, yet they treat us with kindness. Only those absolutely certain of victory behave this way." The Christmas feast broke them. Turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pies, enough for every man to eat until he was sick. It wasn't a celebration of conquest. It was an argument in favor of civilization itself. One prisoner whispered, "If they feed us like this, what do their own soldiers eat?" Beyond the holiday, kindness continued in quieter ways. When Sergeant Hans Müller received a Red Cross telegram that his child had died in Hamburg, the American camp commander personally brought it to him and offered condolences. When Corporal Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she couldn't feed their children, a church group in Ohio sent food parcels to Germany. Enemies, helping enemies. To men trained to see compassion as weakness, it was devastating. The Special Projects Division, a secret branch of the Provost Marshal General's office, quietly monitored the effects. Their reports used a new phrase, ideological collapse syndrome. The Nazi dream wasn't dying by force, it was dissolving in kindness. Soon, Prisoners requested English lessons, American newspapers, even college courses. Major Paul Noland, an observer, noted, "They have seen too much. The fanatics no longer argue. They simply grow silent." Inside the camps, a transformation was underway. Men who once swore oaths to Hitler now debated democracy, free markets, and the meaning of freedom. Their camp newspapers stopped printing slogans and started printing questions. The Americans hadn't planned it this way. They simply lived their values, and the prisoners watched. By the time snow melted in early 1944, thousands of Germans had stopped calling themselves Nazis. They weren't converts by speech or threat. They were witnesses to decency, because when you've been shown mercy by the people you were taught to despise, something fundamental changes. The lie can't survive the light. By the summer of 1944, most of the German prisoners no longer dreamed of escaping. They dreamed of understanding. The camps had become classrooms. In barracks built for confinement, a generation was quietly being re-educated, not by lectures, but by example. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps that June, the impact was seismic. They saw the newsreels, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, an invasion armada beyond comprehension. The same America that fed them turkey dinners was now rolling across Europe with a level of coordination that defied logic. Hauptmann Friedrich von Tauben wrote in his diary, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire idea of the Reich." Defeat no longer meant despair. It meant clarity. Prisoners began volunteering for education programs run by the U.S. Army's Special Projects Division. The University of Chicago mailed correspondence courses. Stanford professors gave lectures on democracy and economics inside the camps. In Camp Shelby, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute named Dr. Wilhelm von Braun attended lectures on atomic theory, taught by Jewish refugee professors, who treated him not with vengeance, but respect. He wrote, "They were ahead of us by years, and they shared their knowledge with enemies. The lesson was unmistakable. Science, progress, and freedom were not German inventions, they were human ones. The camp theaters showed Hollywood films, Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath. To German eyes, it was unthinkable. A country at war showing its own failures to its enemies. In Germany, such criticism meant death. Here, it was patriotism." Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, "They show their problems without fear, and that makes them strong." By late 1944, over 40,000 prisoners were studying English. Camp newspapers debated constitutions, economics, and civil rights. Some even began proposing what a post-war German democracy might look like. They stopped asking how America built its factories and started asking why it built them for everyone. When liberation footage of the concentration camps reached the prisoners in early 45, disbelief turned to shame. The final myth of moral superiority collapsed. Men who once justified conquest now wept openly. They had believed they were warriors for civilization and discovered they were its destroyers. The war had taken their homeland. America gave them something else, a moral compass. By the time repatriation began in 1945, the camps had become workshops for reconstruction. Prisoners learned modern farming, carpentry, and electrical engineering. They were given books, tools, and most importantly an idea that freedom, not fear, built nations. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Wagner wrote before boarding his ship home, "We arrived as soldiers of conquest. We leave as students of democracy. The ships that once carried them in chains now carried them as witnesses, carriers of a new creed that would rebuild their shattered homeland." In Texas, one American officer watched them board and said quietly, "They came as Nazis. They're going home as neighbors." He was right. Because inside those barbed wire fences, Germany's second birth had already begun. May 1945. The war was ending, but the real victory had already been won, not on the beaches of Normandy or in the ruins of Berlin, but in the quiet, sunlit fields of America. Because inside its prison camps, the United States had achieved something no bomb could deliver: redemption through revelation. The men who arrived in Texas as believers in the Reich left as believers in freedom. They had seen democracy with their own eyes, not as propaganda, but as daily life. Electric lights that never went out, cafes open at midnight, women driving cars, black workers operating cranes, Jewish professors teaching physics. Ordinary people living without fear. Those images lodged deep in the minds of the former soldiers. They carried them back across the Atlantic to a Germany smoldering in defeat but hungry for rebirth. In 1946, over 370,000 German prisoners returned home. They stepped onto a continent of rubble, but their memories were filled with light. Some became farmers, rebuilding their land with techniques they'd learned in the Midwest. Others became engineers, applying American efficiency to ruined factories. Many became educators, politicians, and reformers. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught democracy classes behind barbed wire, became president of the European Commission. They were no longer servants of tyranny. They were architects of a new democracy. By the 1950s, journalists searching for the roots of the Wirtschaftswunder, West Germany's economic miracle, found part of the answer in those very camps. The men who had seen America's abundance understood what prosperity built on freedom looked like. They rebuilt their nation not in Hitler's image, but in Roosevelt's. And decades later, when those same men returned to Texas for a reunion in 1985, their words echoed like a benediction. Oberst Hermann Gutz, 78 years old, stood before an audience of Americans and said, "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. You showed us that strength comes not from conquest but from creation. Not from hatred, but from humanity." The auditorium erupted in applause, former enemies standing together, tears on both sides. Because in the end, America's greatest weapon was not the atom bomb, or the B-17, or the Sherman tank. It was the electric light, the symbol of a civilization that created instead of destroyed. For every prisoner who stepped off that train in Mexia, Texas, the journey from darkness to illumination had been literal. They had lived under a regime that worshipped fear and scarcity, and they found themselves in a country that believed in abundance and mercy. That contrast changed them, and through them, changed Europe. The story of the German prisoners of war in America is not just a story of defeat. It's a story of awakening the quiet, human victory that followed the guns. Proof that the most enduring triumphs aren't won by armies, but by example. So, when we look back at that warm June night in 1943, when the first train doors opened and German soldiers stepped into the light of Texas, we can see the moment the war's moral balance began to shift. Because sometimes history doesn't turn with a battle. Sometimes it turns with a light switch.